Hello and good evening. This is Tom Lowenberg from Octavia Books. I am the co-owner of the store, and we are so pleased tonight to be here to for what is essentially the launch event for this new book, Charter School City by Douglas N. Harris. In the wake of the tragedy and destruction that came from Hurricane Katrina in 2005, public school systems in New Orleans eliminated the traditional public education system and replaced it with charter schools and school choice. Douglas N. Harris explores the complex lessons learned in the past 15 years in his new book, Charter School City, available here at Octavia Books, and we have signed copies. Douglas is the chair of the economics department at Tulane and founder of the Education Research Alliance for New Orleans. In his book, he provides an inside look at how and why these reform decisions were made and offers many surprising findings from one of the most extensive and rigorous evaluations of a district school reform ever conducted. Joining him in conversation will be Patrick Dobard, a key player in the reforms himself and the CEO of New Schools of New Orleans. So thank you very much for tuning in. The program will last about an hour, and we do encourage you to pick up a signed copy if you want to show your appreciation or hopefully explore further than you see tonight. So I'm thanking you for being here, and we'll proceed with the program.
Well, thanks so much, Tom, for hosting us. I really love that this is the first event for the book here at Octavia Books, right here at the bookstore down the block. The topic of school reform is really important to the city, and I really wanted to do something here before we went anywhere else. I also appreciate that Patrick Dobard's here to join us. I'm going to introduce him more fully and pull him into the conversation here in a few minutes. And finally, I wanted to express my appreciation for everybody in the audience being here during this time of crisis. New Orleans, of course, is no stranger to crisis. We have a long history with hurricanes and with pandemics. We're also in the midst of a new one now with COVID. So 15 years ago, we had another crisis called Katrina. And before I go into that, I wanted to add that we just barely missed another hurricane recently with Hurricane Laura. That's wreaked some havoc just to the west of us. So I just want to ask everybody to keep our neighbors to the west and in Texas in their prayers, and to call the Red Cross or other organizations if you can make a donation. So the big question is, how do we respond to all these crises? They're coming often these days. We can roll up our sleeves and we can make the best of it. And we can treat these as opportunities to correct old problems, or we can let the challenge get the best of us, allowing the most vulnerable to suffer and letting fear and distrust widen prior divides. Another thing the current COVID crisis has in common with Katrina is the heavy involvement of schools. So some would say that the New Orleans school reforms put in place after Katrina represent an example of making the best of it, and others would say it got the best of us. But one thing not in debate is that the school reforms were unprecedented and momentous. The state took over almost all publicly funded schools in the city and eventually turned management over to nonprofit charter school organizations. These charter schools were subject to strict accountability through performance-based contracts. The new school leaders were given autonomy, especially over hiring, developing, compensating, and firing teachers and other personnel. And in theory, families could now choose the schools their children attend. So when I say school reform, this is what I mean. It's this whole package of policy changes. It was so unprecedented that no city had ever done any one of these things before. And New Orleans did them all at once. And now we've been doing this for about 15 years. It's a chance to look back, and it's also where the title of the book comes from, Charter School City. So that part of the title tells you what the city's schools became, but what were the schools like before? So New Orleans was like just about every city in the country before Katrina. The schools that children attended were traditional public schools. These are schools funded and governed by school districts, led by locally elected board members who set policies and hire school principals, who hire teachers as public employees, working under civil service rules and union contracts. Students attend schools based on attendance zones, meaning based on their neighborhoods. This system of traditional public schools has been in place in almost every corner of the United States for more than a century. And now, 15 years ago, New Orleans put an end to that. This leads to the book's subtitle, What the End of Traditional Public Schools in New Orleans Means for American Education. It also explains why in the book cover there's an eraser and a chalkboard, because it almost literally erased the old system and put in place a new one. So whatever you think of these reforms, whether you support them or oppose them, it's clearly a big deal. Can you think of any other system of schools or anything else that has been eliminated and replaced in one fell swoop? Not much really comes to mind. So it's important to understand what happened here and why. And I wrote this book with 5 goals in mind. One was just to tell the story of the reforms, almost like a good journalist would do. I think it's really a fascinating story. Second, I wanted to put the story in context, the context of the city and its rich history, but also the broader political and ideological debates of school reform nationally. Third, I wanted to describe the effects of the reforms on those who matter most, students. Fourth, I wanted to explain why those effects emerge. You really don't learn lessons from these things unless we understand why things happened, not just whether they happened. And fifth and finally, I wanted to talk about the problems with the reform. So there's a lot of good news in here, but also some issues as well. So what I'm going to do is read some sections of the book that touch on these topics, and then I'm going to turn to Patrick Dobard, and then I'll read a little bit more, and then I'll turn back to Patrick, and also be looking at the questions that you pose as well. So please put in some questions, and those will be forwarded on to me, and we'll try to weave those into the conversation. So first, the story of the reforms. So to understand the New Orleans school reforms, you have to understand what preceded them and what was happening just before the storm. So I'm going to read from the book. The story of New Orleans public schools and where they stood in 2005 has many versions. Many loved their public schools back then. One parent, Ashana Bigard, described to me the safe and caring atmosphere of her daughter's school. Dropping her off was like dropping her off to Andy's house, she said. She's gonna be fine. The schools also challenged her daughter academically and sought to meet her individual needs. Citing Ashana again. By the time she was in 2nd grade, she had already been tested for gifted in mathematics. Then her teacher called me to say, I think she's gifted in drama. And I was like, well, I know she's overdramatic. If you say it's a gift, we'll roll with that. Love that quote. So New Orleanians had an affinity for their schools. One of the first questions the city's natives ask when they meet someone is, what school did you go to? At the festive balls held during the city's Mardi Gras season, announcers introduced the members of their crews by name and high school over the loudspeaker, even if they had graduated from high school a half-century earlier. Another New Orleans native, Patrick Dobard, who you're going to hear about shortly, had a very different story. His parents had attended the city's public schools, as had his older siblings in the 1970s, and they had done well for themselves in college and in life. In 1969, according to Dobard, a young Black man without any means or anything could graduate from a neighborhood public school, Clark High School, and then finish from Tulane University, the Harvard of the South. But by 1981, when he started high school, his parents had given up on public schools and sent him to private schools. Again, quoting Dobard, Clark had deteriorated so much that they wouldn't do it. My parents wouldn't do it. Then in 2005, Clark was the lowest performing high school, not only in New Orleans, but the state of Louisiana. So Dobard's assessment seems consistent with the broader evidence. Only 56% of students in New Orleans public schools graduated from high school in 2005, 10 percentage points below the state average of Louisiana. Of Louisiana's 68 school districts, New Orleans ranked 63rd on this measure and lower on other measures as well. So that was the local context. There was also an interesting national and state context to this that's relevant. So while these reforms happened in New Orleans, they were really a culmination of a quarter century of school reform. In the 1990s, states began expanding test-based accountability, a trend that had reached its peak with the passage of President George W. Bush's No Child Left Behind law. Also in the early 1990s, the first charter school opened in Minnesota. And these schools have now grown to be 7% of school-age children in the US. And criticism started to build on teacher tenure and union contracts. And groups like Teach for America launched. National foundations like the Gates Foundation, the Walton Foundation, and others started to fund other related efforts to upend traditional public education. Louisiana had followed those trends. So just before Katrina, the state had created the Recovery School District as an effort to turn around low-performing schools. The state had also recently passed the charter law just before Katrina, and some of those schools were just opening when Katrina hit. In all these respects, Tulane was a typical state. While the reform ideas nationally had been part of the public conversation going back to the 1990s, their use and implementation were really in their infancy as the storm came barreling into the Gulf. So now that's a fairly dry part of the history, and every good story needs a protagonist. And if you wanted to have school reform and make a big change, you needed someone, at least one individual, determined to make that happen. It all started with Leslie Jacobs. Like many of the reformers who had brought the system into being a century earlier, Jacobs was a business person, a powerful, aggressive local insurance executive. She was sometimes described as a bulldog. After getting involved in the local schools through her philanthropic work, she was elected to the Orleans Parish School Board. So, she was on the local school board before Katrina, had gotten a bit frustrated with that, and then decided that if she wanted to get anything done, she would need to move to the state board of elementary and secondary education, which is a statewide body that also oversees New Orleans schools, but all schools in the state. And that's where she was when Katrina hit. So she had been involved in writing the charter school law. She was a key architect of the Recovery School District law and other changes at the state level. She knew the laws better than anybody because she had written many of them. And then came Katrina. Getting the schools restarted was a high priority. After food, running water, electricity, and police protection, schools are among the most basic necessities. Beyond serving as a place for learning, schools are the heart of the social lives of children and provide important social services such as counseling for traumatic events, and students and their families that just experienced one of the worst traumas imaginable. Also, without schools, parents could not work, and if they could not work, they could not return and get life back to normal again. So I start with that paragraph in part because it's so relevant to the COVID crisis, even though this was all written beforehand. So continuing on, Jacobs was also thinking about the schools, but not in the same way others were. After the initial shock of the hurricane damage, she saw an opportunity. Yes, it would be important to get schools open quickly, but Jacobs' thoughts extended far beyond just opening the doors. Within days of the hurricane, and probably even before the last person evacuated, she was leading private discussions about a major overhaul of the school system. So New Orleans had had hurricanes before. That was no different. But none of the old ones had produced a major overhaul in the school system before. But the conditions were different in 2005 when Katrina hit. The national institutions and leaders were providing funding and support to drive change. The state had already followed suit with the Recovery School District and charter school laws. Locally, almost everyone was frustrated with the traditional public school system, and you had a strong and determined leader in Jacobs well-placed to make an overhaul happen. Now, Jacobs wasn't the only one involved in this effort. Governor Blanco, Senator Mary Andrew, State Superintendent Cecil Picard, Tulane President Scott Cowan, Sarah Houston, Paul Vallis. These are all names that figured prominently in the first few years. And now I want to turn to one other name that has figured prominently in this, and that's Patrick Dobard. So Patrick, why don't you jump onto the screen here and I'll introduce you. Hi there.
Hey, Doug.
So let me just give a quick introduction. So Patrick Dobard is the CEO of New Schools for New Orleans, a nonprofit organization committed to the delivery and the promise of excellent public schools for every child in New Orleans. Dobard served as superintendent of the Louisiana Recovery School District from 2012 to 2017. I think this is one of the things that makes your position unique. You've served in two of the most important leadership roles in a system like this. He's also a native New Orleanian and career educator who began his teaching career in his hometown after graduating from Southern University in New Orleans. So, Patrick, let me turn to you here. What else can you talk about here on where we were before Katrina, based on your own experience or the things that you've learned along the way?
Yeah, and Doug, first of all, I appreciate you for writing this book. I think to just shed some light on what happened and even a little bit before Katrina, but also more importantly after Katrina is extremely important, particularly as we're up on this 15-year anniversary I think before the storm, New Orleans public schools, for decades, it was a mixed bag. You had, a lot of schools, or a lot of kids rather, that were in certain schools that did fairly well. And we also saw a period of time there were a number of public schools that were performing poorly and basically were almost warehousing kids. And so, I would share my own personal story, as you alluded to in the book. In 1969, my oldest brother graduated from Clark and neighborhood school, and my parents sent him there, and he got a good enough education to get accepted to and graduate from Tulane. And then my three siblings right after him, they all went to two of them went to Clark, and one of them went to McDonough 35, which is another neighborhood public school. And all four of them, that was in the 60s and early 70s, graduated from New Orleans high schools, graduated from college. But then my two sisters right over me, my parents started making decisions around they were going to have to scrape up everything they could to send us to Catholic schools, because they were worried that the quality of the neighborhood public schools had deteriorated so badly that they couldn't risk our education. And so I didn't really realize that until many years later. But talking to friends and interacting with different colleagues around the city, I realized that wasn't, unfortunately, it wasn't a unique story. It was the story of many New Orleanians that were seeking alternate paths, particularly in the 1980s, all the way until at least 2005. I think from an administrative standpoint, you had many good educators, well-meaning educators, but the bureaucracy was set so that they often were people who really didn't care, who were there just collecting checks. I mean, I witnessed it myself firsthand. And those were the individuals and things that really drove down the schools. And when you really had people who didn't really care about educating kids, but more so just collecting checks, we saw some of the abysmal results that we had. And so one thing I always say, though, is that it's funny because most New Orleanians, when they reflect on schools, they always mention, their high school that they went to. And the majority of them will just talk about the things like Mardi Gras, being in the band, football rivalries, basketball rivalries, dance team rivalries, the dances that we had at different schools. And nobody ever really talks about and I got a quality education. I really learned something. Right. It's almost like the social aspect, the cultural aspect was what we hung our hats on. And I think after the storm, we started balancing that out with more focus on academics.
And you had also been a teacher before. So I think at the time Katrina hit, you were working in the state, but you had been a school teacher before too, right? Any experience there that you want to share that might be relevant?
Yeah, a couple. So I spent my first 10 years in the classroom, of which almost the first 3 were in New Orleans. And I taught at Gregory Junior High School, which is no longer in existence, but those from New Orleans and who's been around a while will know it was a school that was, reputable junior high school. And they produced a lot of good students out of that, and was a feeder to many of the high schools, particularly some of the Catholic schools. And I just can remember really strong, that was the first place outside of when I went to high school at St. Aug where I saw Black excellence. And so particularly in this time of civil unrest, and when we think about Black leadership, I mean, Stephen Boyard was the principal of Gregory, and Stephen Boyard was like a mythical figure when I got there. It was like Mr. Boyard. Everybody knew Mr. Boyard. And then Lynette Smith, who was the master teacher that I studied under, phenomenal educator. And there were phenomenal educators all at Gregory. And I could just remember that, just taking that for granted. This has to be at every school. But then when I started realizing and understanding around the city, every junior high wasn't staffed like that. Every school wasn't staffed like that. And then getting outside of New Orleans and seeing the same trends, whether it was in Baton Rouge, whether it was in Tensar Parish, areas where I've taught, I saw that there was some systemic dysfunction that wasn't particularly serving Black and brown kids well, and particularly kids in poverty. Yet there were pockets of excellence within that. And it mystified me. Why couldn't all schools have the same quality and that same diversity? And I felt frustrated. So after 10 years in the classroom and not even being able to get promotions that I thought I deserved, one in particular was to be the dean of discipline at a school that I was at in Baton Rouge, but I didn't have the proper credentials. I had an undergraduate degree, secondary ed social studies, and my master's was in history. But they wanted somebody that had the master's plus 30, the traditional ED background or whatever, to be the dean of discipline, when in effect I was doing the work. So I got a little disenchanted, and I'd say I wanted to stay in education, and I applied for several jobs at the Department of Education. took the job as the social studies assessment coordinator. And from there, it took like this trajectory that I didn't see coming over a 16-year period.
Yeah, that idea that there were pockets of excellence and there were good things happening in the district is something I hear a lot. And so even those who saw big problems with the existing system saw that there were people who, I think the way it's described is kind of the way you described it. They were overcoming the system more than being supported by the system. Is that a fair?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. Cynthia Morrell, former city council person, mother of former state senator J.P. Morrell. She always reminds me, she was like the first unofficial charter school head, because she ran the school. I believe it was Mac 32 in the French Quarter. I might have the Mac wrong, but it was the school in the French Quarter. And she ran it. She, in essence, told me she had that freedom within OPSB. It was like, as a principal, she got empowered. She can hire, like, they didn't really mess with her. And it shouldn't be that because of a strong-willed, progressive leader like she was and is, to have to just then say, you know what, just don't mess with me. Let me do what I do. And I'm going to serve these kids well. And she had the arts in there. She was telling me about it. She had, the music. And it was like housed right there in the quarter. And so I just kept thinking about that. It was the will of some of these leaders. I look at it, I call it now like the cult of personality. Like, she's got a strong personality. Stephen Boyard had one. There are these principals at some of these schools that were able to overcome the bureaucracy and some of the things that was really just holding it down. And then when there wasn't that, where it was just almost, people were getting promotions because of tenure and not because of qualifications. And also you started seeing just like this mass influx of kids where they didn't really have new buildings, didn't have a master plan, didn't have any plans for growth in the system. You just started seeing schools becoming like these de facto warehouses where not much learning was going on.
Yeah, no, it's very helpful to hear it. You had different angles on the pre-reform situation based on both your own experience as a student and as a teacher. So that's very helpful. Let me talk a little bit about another part of the book just for a couple minutes, and let's turn back to the conversation. So, another part of the context here, I talked a lot about the local context, is the national context.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things the discussion of Leslie Jacobs and others suggest is that there was it was a fairly top-down reform. That every name I listed was someone in a position of authority at the state level, primarily, almost everybody, one exception. In Baton Rouge, not in New Orleans. In fact, a majority of the New Orleans delegation in the state legislature voted against the laws necessary to implement the reforms. The national or outsider character of the reforms was also reflected in the national debate, and an ideological battle really about the role of government versus markets. So the traditional public education system was said to be government-driven, and it is governed by officials elected by voters who create centralized bureaucracies to make decisions. In contrast, the New Orleans reforms are more market-driven, where authority is pushed down from district-wide school boards down to individual schools and charter management organizations, just like small companies would be in a marketplace. And parents could choose the schools that they wanted for their kids, just like consumers shopping at the mall, searching for schools that best fit their children's needs. And in theory, therefore, schools would have to compete for customers. And if families didn't like what they were getting, then they would go elsewhere, and schools would close, and new ones would innovate and come in and replace them. So, in short, the government approach gives power to voters and to the officials they elect, and markets give power to consumers, in this case, families, as well as to school leaders. And when you shift power in those ways, you get a different set of decisions. So now you might, and I'm now talking to the whole audience, people come to this conversation with different views about markets and governments. And I think in our divided world, Republicans usually want less government, Democrats want more government. But I think one lesson of the book is that's not really the right way to think about it. The reason is pretty simple, that governments and markets are good at different things and need different roles. Governments are better at providing things that we have to share with one another relatively equally. These things, which also tend to be essential to basic human needs and somewhat standardized, we loosely call public goods. The military, water supply, roads, these are all examples of that. Markets, in contrast, are better at providing goods that we consume individually according to our own needs. these things tend to be less essential, less standardized, and consumed unequally. And we loosely call these private goods. So there's a lot of debate about where schools fall on that. A school, is it a public school? Is it a public good, or is it a private good? This is really an old debate. You can make a reasonable case that schooling is both. On the one hand, it's clearly a public good. For example, in a civil society, there are certain kinds of knowledge and values and traditions that have to be shared and that all citizens need for society to function. And for this reason and others, I argue in the book that some roles for government are necessary and important, and that a free market in schooling would be both inefficient and inequitable. On the other hand, governments can fail. And I think we certainly saw that in some of what you were describing earlier. And different students have different needs, and parents know a lot about those needs. School leaders know a lot about those needs. So that calls more for a market role and more of a private good way of looking at it. So I bring this up in part to think about, well, what were the school leaders in New Orleans thinking? What motivated Leslie Jacobs and others to go this route? And so I'd be interested in hearing your take on that. So you were in state government when Katrina hit and when the conversations about school reform were starting. Talk about when you first started to get pulled into those conversations and what attracted you to what they were saying and why they wanted to do this.
Yeah, it was many years before I got pulled into like those type of conversations. So when Katrina hit, I was, as Paul Pastorak likes to tease, so I was down in the bowels of the Department of Ed. And so I was literally what one might call like the chief of staff for the first superintendent of the RSD at the time, which was Robin Jarvis. So many people, it's like little known history fact. Robin Jarvis was the first superintendent. And at that time, right before Katrina, the Recovery School District was just something on paper that hadn't been actualized on. And for me, I knew of it. I knew they were looking at maybe 2 schools to launch, and they had a team of 2 people that was ultimately going to head it at that time. The head was going to be a gentleman by the name of Leroy Elair, who coincidentally was a principal at a school that I worked at in Baton Rouge. And I can remember him trying to wrap his mind around what was this. And then literally overnight, when Katrina hit, everything changed. And so there was months of planning, and I wasn't high up in the organization yet to be in those conversations. So I basically was watching the offices that Robin was over. I ended up managing that while she was almost detailed to figure out what was happening in New Orleans with Cecil Picard, Carol Wallen, who was the deputy for Cecil Picard, and then the board members. And at that time, Leslie Jacobs was someone who I just knew from afar. Like I knew she was on the board. I had a great deal of respect. And I told her the first time that I sat down and met with her, that first thing I told her was like, thank you. Thank you for creating an accountability system, because I got tired of having students graduate and then they couldn't fill out a job application coherently. So I ardently supported having state standardized tests. And then for years, I worked on creating with a team the social studies part of the test. And I always told people, like, when the state set the bar at approaching basic, which is the second lowest tier, it's unsatisfactory, approaching basic, basic, mastery, and advanced. I can remember teachers revolting against Leslie Jacobs because the bar was set at approaching basic. When on a 60-item multiple choice test, it literally meant you get about 30 items right, and Louisiana was saying that you were proficient. It ticked me off. And so I told her, like, for you to, like, in part think of this and then have the desire to push this through against like such a current that's coming against you, I say, I have nothing but respect for what you did on that, and thank you. And then from that, I just remember, like, I was always on the periphery until Paul Pastorak came on. And when Paul Pastorak came on, I probably was like his first promotion / hire, where he didn't quite know what role I could fill, but he wanted me to basically be like his almost chief of staff. We called it, and just like a program officer type person. Confidential assistant was the title they gave me. And from there, then I started getting introduced to the Sarah Usdens, the Matt Candlers, the Neerav Kingslands, all of the different players. And then Paul assigned me to be his liaison for all of the Orleans delegation, really all of the legislature, the Orleans delegation, as well as legislators in general. So I got to like know the former Speaker of the House, Joe Salter, and got access to like all of the major political leaders, where then I started being a conduit once I started understanding how the system was structured. And so one of the things I can remember is like Leslie Jacobs, she always believed in just like moving fast. And I wasn't privy to the things that they might have been doing at that time that was done, as you mentioned in the book, and we all say it, like to the community versus like with the community. It's just like stages of it. So when you think about from 2006 to like 8 or 9, that was a lot of like building that I wasn't like right in the mix of. But starting around 2010, then I started getting introduced to all of these different players and all of the different folks and moved up in my role, where then I started understanding that, okay, this is big. There's a lot of moving parts to this. And then starting understanding like what a portfolio model was and how all the pieces fit together, how the legislation fit together, and then how the philanthropic and the national piece fit together. And so I would just say that the reason that I was attracted to it and was able to stick with it is because regardless of those folks' background, which most of them are wealthy, white, some of them Democrat, some of them Republican, I agreed with the majority of their philosophy around high standards, around your zip code shouldn't determine your destiny, and around that schools absolutely have to be better. Because I always applied it to like students that I taught or students that I've mentored, whether it's through the churches that I've attended, and saw where the public schools were failing them. And so for me, it was personal to be able to use the process that had been created by the so-called reform family. And then I felt like I could use my vantage point to shed light on the nuances within that to them, so they wouldn't remain, so I think, blind to some of the realities that was going on in the community.
So they kind of pulled you in, and it sounds like the reasoning was your way of thinking about it. The problems in education were similar to what Leslie described to me. That you were really focused on getting students to get basic academic skills that they weren't getting. The standards weren't high enough. The push wasn't hard enough to get students up to snuff, so to speak, on academic skills.
Absolutely. I mean, even today. I mean, about 23% of students in New Orleans and really statewide are at mastery, meaning that they're on grade level. We set the bar right below that at basic, which is way better than approaching basic, but basic didn't mean every child was on grade level. But when we talk about growth, we are like really doing better than just about every urban area in the state. In our subgroups, our African-American students are outperforming their peers and closing the gap on non-African-American students. And yet only about 23% are like at mastery. And so for me, it's always been about the academic improvement. Like there's just no reason that we still have children who are not on grade level by the time they get to 8th grade and by the time they get out of high school. And so for me, that's what appealed to me most about what Leslie and others were trying to do.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting background. And one of the reasons I asked the question is I think there are sort of two ways of approaching this. One is partly for me as an academic, and the way academics have this conversation and the way the national reformers tend to have the conversation is much more abstract. It's like, so we need more markets and get the politics out and get government out. And that really wasn't the way when I got down here. That wasn't the way I was hearing you talk or Leslie talk. It was just you were being pragmatic. You would do whatever you had to do, put in whatever system, whatever government, whatever market, whatever to get those outcomes up. Right?
That's true. That is so true. But I look at it in hindsight. I wish I had pushed more for a holistic approach of it. But at the same time, when you look at the academic gains, that 2005, about 68% of schools were F schools in New Orleans. Today, a little bit less than 8%, where only 1 out of 3 students were graduating on time. Early on, or maybe a little higher, we've gotten it up to 3 out of 4 graduating on time. And so it took that type of focus to make those types of gains, yet the systemic inequities are so large. We have to look at opportunities now in order to start closing gaps in other areas that are tied to academics.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good transition to the next topic. So one of the goals I had for the book was simply to describe what happened to students. That was one of that's the most important constituency here. That's what matters here, is what happens to students. So let me talk a little bit about the test score. So here I need to give a little bit of my own background and experience. So you might remember earlier when I said that the New Orleans reforms were a culmination of a quarter century of school reform that had started in the early 1990s. Well, before I came to Tulane in 2012, I had studied those national reform efforts. And when I came down here, I have to say I was actually a little bit skeptical, because if you looked at what was happening in school reform at the time, charter schools nationally on average were not doing as well as the traditional public schools in their neighborhoods. We'd seen some instances where school reform seemed to work, but then when we looked more carefully at the data, it seemed to be there was some other explanation going on. For example, with test-based accountability, which was really strong and a big part of the story in New Orleans, we worry about teaching to the test and narrowing the curriculum to topics that are covered on the test. And so in those ways, you can make the results look good even when there's not more real learning going on. I also knew one of the most consistent findings in all of education research, that student outcomes are closely related to the student opportunities to learn outside of school, and that those opportunities are strongly correlated with parent income and parent education levels. And since Katrina had changed the population of the city, the most affluent families might have come back at higher rates, and that this might have made the results look good in ways that really had nothing to do with the reform. So honestly, when I came here, I was pretty skeptical. I thought, I saw you look at the results just going up and up and up after the reform started, and I thought, there's got to be something going on here, because no district had ever done anything like that was actually the result of the school reform side. But I kept an open mind. I said, okay, well, let's look. We know how to look for these things in the data. So we looked for creating a body of research, objective, rigorous, useful research. I started the Education Research Alliance for New Orleans, and I just want to pause here and thank my whole team, because everything I'm talking about here and in the book is owed very much to them as well. We had a great team of researchers, and we created an advisory board. You're a member of the advisory board that included supporters and opponents of the reform. So we had some. We have interesting board meetings, don't we? When everybody's in the room, because everybody's looking at this totally differently.
Absolutely.
But I think at this point, people are saying when we email them, like, you got another study? Like, how many studies can you do? But it turns out the answer is about 3 dozen. That's how many we've done so far. And we've published a lot of those in academic journals as well. So we studied it from every angle, every question. Anytime anybody had a concern, we tried to find a way to do a study on what those things were. So we dug pretty deeply, and it turned out after all that work that the improved outcomes really did reflect improvement in the system and real academic gains. So the reforms raised the average student score in the city from the 22nd percentile nationally to the 37th percentile, which might not sound like a lot, but I've still not seen another district improve that much in that period of time. To get the whole district to move that way was unusual. High school graduation rates increased 3 to 9 percentage points. College enrollment increased 8 to 15 percentage points. College completion increased 3 to 5 percentage points. The results improved for all groups: Black and white, rich and poor, special education, non-special education. Opportunity gaps declined. Parent satisfaction improved. And we could rule out those other explanations through some in-depth analysis. So this is the second way in which I think the reforms were unprecedented. No one had ever put a system like this in place before, and that made it unprecedented. But I also haven't seen another district that got these kind of measurable results before. Mm-hmm. So, any other thoughts on that? You started to allude to the improved outcomes before, but any further insights or thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, I think part of that is because I think, Doug, is that was like the low-hanging fruit when you think about it. Like some of the things, and you mentioned it in your book, like a lot of it wasn't innovative in the purest sense of the word. Right. But it's sad because the innovation was around the basics that should have been happening pre-Katrina, and it just wasn't. So when you had these pockets of success, but you had more, of these, and to think of it as an archipelago. So you got all these little islands, right? You had more little islands that wasn't paid attention to. Where now, just with some attention, you saw the dramatic growth. And that's what I always say. We showed more attention to the kids with people feeling the pressure of, man, if I don't move this, I'm gonna lose my ability to educate them. And I think that's like the thing, that pressure, and it works both ways, because then people would say, well, you're putting too much pressure on people keeping their schools open, so therefore they'll do anything. They may cheat, they may do whatever. But, for those people who are above board, they took on the pressure of, okay, in 5 years, I got to get these results that I said I'm going to get, or I might lose my charter. And I think that drove people from a place of systemic complacency, which you saw a lot of prior, to like, I got to get this done. So that hustle attitude, like, we got to get this done. We got to get the basics done, which may not have been innovative, again, in its purest sense, but it truly was innovative because that wasn't being done across the board in New Orleans. And so I think, that's what drove it. And, the interesting thing is that we're trying now to figure out, okay, well, what's additive to that? Because that's just not going to keep moving the needle. And I think that's part of the reason you've seen Rose scores start to flatline and even slightly dip a little bit, with some other things not moving to Common Core and the Tier 1 standards, et cetera. But I do feel like, that there was just a lot of different things that were basic and fundamental that wasn't being done across the board. And that drove a lot of the growth.
Now let's expand on that a little bit, because you were in a unique position, because you were both the head of the Recovery School District, making a lot of those accountability decisions, tough decisions on schools that weren't succeeding, and now with New Schools for New Orleans, that your group also had an interesting role at the beginning in trying to incubate new charter operators and so on. So talk more about that and those decisions and how you handled that.
Yeah. So, I took over the RSD in 2012. And at that time, there was a lot of discussion about, RSD had been doing things to the community and not with the community. And when John White came on in 2011, John and I, one of the reasons I came to work full time for the RSD, because John was like, Patrick, I really would want you to be like my right hand. When people see us in anything with us, I want people to think of us as one, as a team. And I need your New Orleans experience to help navigate this. And I was compelled by that. And the fact that he thought of it as like a partnership with me, he didn't have to offer that, but he was just sincere in how he wanted to go about this and humble about it. And so he and we embarked together and built out these teams. And I could remember early on, like realizing how big it was in the sense of trying to make determinations around what we call school sightings. Like, you had these buildings or buildings about to be built, and then who was going to go in them. And I was just getting a grasp of how it could work when John then got tapped to be state superintendent. And then it just fell on me to have to figure it out along with him. And I remember that's when I first started interacting with a gentleman by the name of Niref Kingsland, who was he was the CEO of New Schools for New Orleans. And Niref, they would do what we call scenario planning. They would say, hey, if the RSD was so inclined, here's an operator we think that would be good to go with this building, and start planning that. And so we had a team at the RSD that would do what we call scenario planning. But the one thing I wanted to do was do it different than what predecessor to superintendents before me, Paul Vallis, did, where they just kind of made those decisions in a vacuum and assigned it, and then hoped the community would get along with the schools. What I told Nirav and others, I wanted to create a step where the community would have input. And then much later, maybe about 2 years into my tenure, we really got good at it in the sense that we would give operators we were considering to assign to facilities and to schools, and then let the community sort of interview them, vet them, and then the community tell us through a process we put in place who they would rank number one. And for all but one instance, and we might have did this about 7-8 times, maybe a little bit more when I was superintendent, all but one time, they would have been a choice had I picked it in a vacuum or had NSNO recommended it in a vacuum, which felt good, like we had a good sense of it. But it didn't always go smoothly. Some of those early site selections where we didn't have that process fully in place or in place at all, there was a lot of community pushback. There was a lot of angst because many of the operators weren't connecting with the community in ways that they should have. And so it made sense to me, though, the idea of the assignments, but it also showed me that there was a blind spot on community, and we had to fix that. And so I'm glad we were able to implement things to make that a bit better.
Yeah. I'm going to just pause for a second and just remind everybody in the audience to send us questions, and we're going to try to weave those in as well. The general question we're on right now is why did the student outcomes improve so much? And you anticipated my answer, which is when we look at it in the data, the accountability system seemed to be the main driver. So just a couple of numbers to kind of add on to what you said. There are about 80 schools or so, give or take, in New Orleans at any given time, or that have been over the last 6 or 7 years. And more than 40 schools have been taken over in the 15 years since Katrina. So that shows that that you were strict, that you meant business when it came to the test scores and getting those outcomes up.
Yeah.
Clearly, the clearest factor that drove the improvement was just that cycle of, okay, you tried one school and it didn't work, so we're going to get rid of that school and we're going to give somebody else a chance to do it.
Yeah, it's I'm laughing because I'm thinking, like, what's the guy's name? Pete Cook. He coined me Knuckles Dobard. I think in part because I took a picture that they put in that week where I look real like serious, but it also was like that when it came to school turnarounds, that I wasn't compromising if an operator missed it by like less than a point, which we had that happen, or whether you missed the mark by like 10, 15, 20 points, which we had that happen, and everything in between. Because one, I never wanted to make a decision where then it felt like I could be pressured because of something that wasn't like concrete and very analytical and very clear. And so I had just made up my mind. If we had other options, I was hoping that they would be better and that I could definitively say. And I think, I was a bit, too confident and too loose in the way that I would say, like, we were guaranteeing that the schools were going to be better. What I should have said is, our hope is that the schools are going to be better, but we can't continue on with who we have. And so I think the language that was used made it seem like, we might have been like really callous or like, it's just, we did draw the hard line. But at the same time, in all of those, we always hoped that the transformations would be better. And I know some of the research that Stanford and Credo had done, some of the research you've done, Doug, showed that more often than not, the turnarounds worked, but also they didn't have like a great success rate across the board. I believe maybe was it about 50%, Doug, of the turnarounds, or maybe a little bit more than that didn't hit, like it was like a 1-for-1, but overall transformations put kids in better performing seats, which that was ultimately the goal.
Yeah, that's one thing that's clear in the data is that on average, if you when you took over a school, usually a very low performing school, and the school that replaced it on average was, in every year we looked at that, the average school that closed was considerably lower performing than the schools that were open to replace it. Like, there was 1 year where it was just a couple of schools and it didn't go as well.
Yeah.
One other factor that we haven't talked about in terms of why outcomes improve, which is a harder one to isolate, is school funding. So I think the research now is really clear that money matters in schools. You can't hire and retain good teachers if you can't pay them well. And New Orleans experienced a 13% increase in operating funding, annual funding, relative to other districts. So there was a noticeable improvement there. I think it's hard to isolate, but my sense of the evidence is that it's very unlikely that this was a primary explanation, partly because I think the size of the change in funding wasn't enough. But also, if we had just put money in without the reform, if we look back at the prior evidence, that the district was already at about the state average pre-Katrina, but the performance was way below average, towards the very bottom of the state. And so it seemed pretty clear that the district wasn't doing well with the money before. And so it was really the combination then of funding and the reform that made those resources used more effectively. So it's another element when we say the reform. We're usually talking about the school autonomy and choice and the accountability system, but funding was also kind of intertwined with that.
Yeah. No doubt, no doubt. And I think along with funding, the level of talent in the C-level positions. But the money did make a big difference. When you were able to get money from philanthropic causes to help folks like launch schools on top of the state MFP dollars, that's a big boost. And that allowed people to be able to use the resources. They already had the flexibility to use it. Now they were able to use it just in different ways. That was pretty progressive. But I also feel like you had a lot of talented individuals, whether they were veteran people who were there before, and you also had people who were coming into the city. So I think of people like, in the early days, like Jay Altman. I think of Sharon Clark, veteran principal from New Orleans. Both of them were like New Orleans veterans, but then ultimately moved on, moved into different roles as running their own networks or single sites. You had folks like Ben Kleben, Ben Markovitz, Jamar McNeely, Kate Mihawk, who all were like cutting their teeth, but they are like, if they're still there, they're like really class individuals that care deeply, but about kids. But more than that, they're like executors. And so you give those folks those type resources, you see the results that we have. And so I would say that's a part of the story that doesn't get told enough about some of these people who came, and some were from New Orleans. So you got Kelly Baptiste and others that's from New Orleans, and they were in there grinding just as much. They weren't connected to some of the TFA networks and that sort of thing, but their level of talent and their ability, when they were also given access to resources, showed how all of them rose up. And I think that doesn't get told enough because, I know in your book, you talk a little bit about the family. And before we came on, you teasing and saying, it's like almost I'm adopted in the family because I'm like, I wasn't cut from the cloth of all the other reformers like TFA ties. Like I didn't even really know what TFA was until like 2010. Like it just was something that was out there, but I wasn't like connected like a lot of the folks that I mentioned are through that. But what I find is that because I philosophically agreed with a lot of the things that was going on, and saw these people like working and hustling all the time to serve these kids, it made me want to just continue to step up and help them as best I could. So like, I agree with you, Doug. The academic pushes, the funding was huge, but don't forget the talent. The talent was, we had some top level talent and still do.
Yeah, and just to clarify for the audience if they haven't read the book, so there's a part in the book where I talk about the reformers being a family and how they were really, there was a consistent group of people that were rotating roles, right? So you were in the Recovery School District, and then you were in New Schools for New Orleans, and Sarah Houston was at New Schools for New Orleans, and now is on the local school board. There were lots of people like that who were sort of rotating amongst positions, and that New Orleans is a small enough place where all the key leaders knew each other and were interacting with each other and had a level of trust that was more family-like than I think what you would see in other places. So I just wanted to give the audience a background on what you were referring to there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one question from Facebook here, and again, encourage folks to send questions in either by Facebook or YouTube. It says, in addition to accountability, were there systemic supports for educators, like professional learning communities and so on, that have contributed to improvements in student outcomes? Any thoughts on that question?
Not that I can recall immediately. When I was over to RSD, there was still a healthy amount of competition, and school leaders, they played it close to the vest, like what they were doing, that sort of thing. And one of the things that I did regularly was convene and meet with schools. I looked at schools as partners. So even though I was over to RSD, I felt like we were the regulator for them, but I also felt like they were partners because I wanted them to succeed. Look, I didn't want to have to close schools every year. So I needed them and wanted them to succeed. But there wasn't yet an entity that could take on that environment to create PLCs where they were respected enough, where the school leaders felt like, well, I should listen to you and take advantage of what you're offering. Now, fast forward to today, NSNO, we've created that, but also a lot of the members from my team are veterans in this over the last several years. So we've built a credibility with schools. So when we say, hey, we have this instructional quality initiative and we're creating these professional learning communities, schools know they can opt in or opt out, but many are opting in because we know from them that this is a need and you want to see that environment created. So now, one leader, I mentioned her name, I got to give Kate Mihawk a lot of credit. And I know sometimes, Kate catches a rap on things and nobody's perfect. and she and we have like very good working relationship. She's one of the people who I would say first came around to often acquiescing to what's best for the system. Like she was one of the first ones. Okay, we'll do one app, and okay, we'll have a centralized expulsion and hearing office, and all those things help the improvements of the system. And even like now, when we were coming up with the ideas of a fellowship and trying to get some C-level talent in their schools that we ultimately might groom to leave them one day, or maybe take over for them, she was one of the first ones to sign up. And so that cooperative spirit, in the sense of like really getting under the hood and being that vulnerable, wasn't a driver of some of the success, let's say 7 years ago, but is definitely part of the success now, because leaders feel, I think, more confident in their roles, and they realize that we all have to rise up together. And so trying to be secret because of whatever reasons is not beneficial to the system as a whole.
Yeah, this question reminds me of a couple of things. One is, it goes back to the idea of the reform family and how New Orleans is a small enough place where pretty much all the school leaders knew each other, and we're meeting. Like, I know you used to organize these meetings in the state RSD offices, so they got to know each other. And New Orleans is small enough where you just bump into people at coffee shops and things. It's a small place, and that wasn't an official professional learning community, but it created relationships that fundamentally, that's kind of what professional learning is about those relationships. The other thing is that there were all these informal networks, or that sort of semi-formal networks that emerged. The Cowan Institute organized a lot of these on different topics. They have one on college counselors in the high schools to help counselors get students to college. They're going to talk about another topic here, the arts, where there were some of it was even outside the system. It was just nonprofits or networks that would emerge because you didn't have the district. The district would normally have a coordinator of just about everything, and everything would be organized through the coordinator, and there would be formal professional development. But this was a much more informal set of processes. I want to go on to. I'm going to come back to some of the questions that have also been posed, but I want to get to the last topic, which is the problems with the reform. So we haven't actually talked a lot about, most of it so far is about the good news. You alluded to some of what I was going to bring up. One was early on in the reforms, the lack of involvement of the community in this. I want to read a couple of quotes about this. These are quotes, especially I think pertaining to the early years of the reforms and how people perceived it. So this is from someone who had applied for a charter school, and the person says, "We tried, we really did, but because it became clear that they didn't want us, we didn't have we didn't have a board made up of people who weren't from New Orleans or who had only taught for 2 years. You'd think that would be a good thing, huh? But nope, we represented a failed, bloated black bureaucracy. Controlling and operating schools isn't for us, it's for them," meaning for whites. And so this gets to the topic of inclusion in the process. New Orleans, the schools serve an almost entirely black population. The city's majority black, but there is this divide in the city that persists to today. Partly because of the way the reforms were put in place. That list of people I mentioned at the beginning of a lot of the key leaders of the reforms. That list was all white and substantially outsider driven. People who weren't really from here, and so how do you think about that problem? Is that something you hear about? I have to imagine you get questions about that and get concerns about that problem.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I think about like its origin, so some of the main characters you mentioned in the book. All of those individuals, whether it was Cecil Peacock, Leslie Jacobs, Paul Pastorak, John White, obviously Paul Vallis, all of them white, and some of them from out of state. And I think, that happened the same with New Schools for New Orleans early on, and some of the networks and individuals had, where they were, just putting things together. And there wasn't probably, I wasn't involved at that early stage, so I don't know what overt consciousness or not that they had around the racial dynamics. But I do know once I got intently involved, and I can talk about it from like 2011 on, is that I recognized it, And from my vantage point, whenever I had an opportunity to affect it for the positive, then I did everything I could to do that. So for an example would be, many of the single sites in New Orleans were Black single site led schools. And so there were former principals who ended up becoming like the leaders, like Alexina Medley over Warren Easton. I mentioned Sharon Clark over Sophie B. Wright. You had Doris Hicks over MLK, Martin Luther King. And so you had these veteran Black educators, but most of the other ones who were heads of organizations were white-led CEOs of the largest CMOs, whether it was KIP, First Line, Crescent City, which was growing, and Renew was really the bigger one. But a lot of their top talent and individuals for some of the networks, not all of them, but some of them were people of color. And so I think it was just this dynamic. And you mentioned NACSA, the National Association of Charter School Authorizers, so I'm on their board. So for full disclosure, when they were putting their processes together, I think one of the biggest flaws they had was the process that they put in place in order to have individuals get approved to go to Bessie to run schools did not have like this, what I would call community feel. And it didn't have a feel for where, like, if you didn't write your applications in a certain way, you almost didn't make it to the rounds to where you could talk about your schools and you weren't just going to get a shot. Like, it's like, okay, you didn't meet this minimum standard. And what I found was a lot of the applicants getting denied were like the local Black mom and pops who didn't really have maybe down what they were used to seeing if they got an application for somebody that might have came out of like the KIP network, who might have spun off and wanted to run a school. And once I got to understand it, I'll never forget, there was a Bessie meeting with Luella Gibbons, former Bessie member, and Chaz Rome, a former Bessie member. It was one of the few times I remember where Chaz and Luella, like, who were always on the opposite side, I mean, like heated opposite sides, they agreed on this one thing, because Chaz made the comment that he felt like for these applicants that kept getting denied, that there should be almost a separate process and we should give them like more access to get in. And that's what Luella was pushing for. And so that always stuck in my mind. So when I was able to get opportunities to what I would call give people a shot, or to get NACSA to understand how to make that process not just so linear, because then you're excluding certain people because of whatever things, I think it got a little bit better. But yes, it's still, it's tough because there were a lot of people who weren't of color that helped to put things in place that helped us to get to where we are. That's not to say that people of color couldn't do it. Yeah. It's just that people were moving at a pace where they weren't stopping to see how much inclusivity they had like we do now.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that what you're saying highlights is how much the reforms have changed. So it's been 15 years since the reforms, but it's really like 3 or 4 different phases over time.
Absolutely.
It's been changing. One other problem I want to make sure we get to briefly is the narrowing of the curriculum. So we actually have a study coming out on the arts here soon, and as a slight preview, one of the findings is that the arts became something that was more of a tool for raising test scores and for incentivizing students to work harder. That there were schools that would have these enrichment detentions where if a student wasn't doing well academically, they wouldn't be allowed into their arts class until they did better academically. So it wasn't basically the richness of the arts became lost, and it was more of a marketing device. That sort of the theme of things, and this is based on interviews with art educators in the schools. What's your sense of that issue and what might be done about that?
You were saying that they were saying that it was done before the storm, or this was?
No, this is after. This is based on interviews that were done recently about how the arts are being played out now, given all the pressure to raise test scores.
Oh, okay.
It's playing out that way, that the schools are just focusing everything on test scores, and everything becomes a tool of raising scores.
That it's tricky. I think, one, I'm a supporter of having the arts, music in school, because I think that is additive to the curriculum. And that's why I kind of had to make sure I understood, because I don't get much of that. Like what I get is that there are a lot of individuals, you have to focus on the core curriculum, because a lot of our children still struggle. Like, we still have this problem where 5 and 6 year olds are not coming to school prepared. And, we have an early childhood situation where we have to get much better having children prepared and ready for kindergarten, ready for first grade. And at the same time, I think not because of pressures of testing, a lot of it is like allocation of resources. So we have a lot of students that we have to make, or schools rather, that have to make determinations for students around, more money towards the arts or more money toward trauma-informed pedagogy. We still have kids in New Orleans that are 3-5 times the national average of dealing with trauma. And post-COVID, and post the civil unrest because of the systemic murder of Black men at the hands of the police in parts around this country, that's a lot to have to help navigate in order to educate kids. And so schools are making choices not just to say, well, we have these challenges from a strictly curriculum standpoint and we have to pass these tests. It's a matter of we have limited resources. We do have to get these kids academically up to par, but we also have to deal with their socio-emotional challenges. We have to deal with, we want to give them a balanced school experience. So we have athletics, we have to factor in arts, we have to factor in music within that. And so I think it's not because of testing and the rigor. I think it's because even though we had, like at one point, more dollars per pupil, but now it's almost back at a state average. It's the resources and the intent needs of our students, and you have to make choices of what you're going to serve for those kids when you can't serve just about everything the way that you would want to.
Yeah. There are two questions that I'm going to try to address quickly since we're running a little low on time, both about student outcomes. So one says, having implemented a charter school system, has the New Orleans School District performance met or exceeded the state's average performance? I think there are a couple measures on which the answer was yes, in the sense that we got up to the state average. And then I think there's been a little bit of a tapering off or at least stagnation since about 2013 in the data. So I think for the most part, the district is not quite to the state average still, but got a lot closer than it had been before. The second question about outcomes is, if we're doing so great, then why are so many young people still involved in crime? So we actually have a study that we're working on. There's yet another study for our board members to take a look at. We are trying to look at the effects on these longer term outcomes. So we've always saw as our mission trying to understand the full set of life outcomes and everything that schools are expected to do. And so there are different ways to measure that. Crime is an important measure. So we're looking at that right now to see, as I can't give an answer to that question yet, whether crime has dropped as a result of the reforms. We don't have a clear answer to that one just yet. So I want to end with, actually, there's one other question here. Sorry, on gentrification. How do you see gentrification impacting the relationship between schools and changing community demographics? One thing I talk about in the book is how the shift to choice has affected neighborhoods. We haven't studied this directly, but you can almost see logically how students don't attend schools near their homes anymore. The average distance to school increased by about 2 miles in terms of where students are actually attending, and they're on the bus early in the morning, at least in regular times outside of COVID. So I think it does affect communities. Just the choice system itself affects communities. It's actually one of the other, I think, unintended effects of the reforms. Not clear. I'm not sure I have a clear answer on gentrification and how that might be affecting schools in the changing community. We've studied segregation, school segregation. So we've looked at it that way, but we haven't looked at, and I think your intended question is really about housing segregation and gentrification. Let's see. So I'm gonna end by just kind of giving a shout out again to Octavia Books. They wanted me to mention that there are signed copies available at the store, and we really want to support our local businesses here. I wanted to close just by reading the last 2 paragraphs of the book. I think it pulls together some of these themes nicely. So my main goal has been to describe what happened in New Orleans and why, as accurately and completely as possible. It's a story worth telling, especially if doing so helps to move school reform forward in some small way, by kindling ambition in our educational goals, creating creativity in our thinking, and the realism that comes from hard evidence. it's useful to see something that is both new and measurably successful, as it forces us to question things that we've long taken for granted. Before Katrina, New Orleans may have been the last place on earth to expect anything innovative. Some would say that the same right now about the country as a whole. Scholars, experts, and advocates have fretted about how tepidly we pursue even the most modest of educational goals. My hope is that other cities and states will build on the New Orleans experience with a desire to copy not its design and process, but its ambition and inventiveness. No system will ever be enough by itself, as each system is what people make of it. But the decisions we make about the roles of governments, markets, non-governmental organizations do shape the character of our schools. These decisions are not to be taken lightly, given that the character of our schools, in subtle yet powerful ways, shapes the character of the children they serve. So thank you very much, everybody. Patrick, thanks so much for being part of this conversation. Thanks to the audience for chiming in with questions, and hope people will be interested enough to keep reading. We've just touched the surface of the book at this point, and hope to hear more from everybody. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Zach.